All right, we'll get started tonight. Hi, folks. Welcome to this latest in our lecture series presented by the Albert Kahn Legacy Foundation. I'm John Gallagher, your host for this evening, and we're delighted to welcome Karen Miller, who's an associate professor of Oakland University, who's going to talk to us tonight about Albert Kahn and the making of Detroit. Karen will talk for about 45 minutes during her presentation, and then we'll go to a Q&A. You'll notice at the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A button. If you want to address a question, please click on that and type your question in, and we will get to those. Before we get to Karen, a couple of notes. If you're here tonight, you probably know a little bit about the foundation, but the Albert Kahn Legacy Foundation is a nonprofit 501c3 organization that honors the life and legacy of Detroit's great architect, Albert Kahn. We honor that through our mission in all kinds of ways, including this lecture series, which is being recorded, by the way, this evening, and this will appear on our website along with past videos of past lectures in the series. We also do walking tours. We've had a bicycle tour. We did a museum exhibit at the Detroit Historical Museum and multiple other ways that we carry out this mission. We thank our members and sponsors that allow us to do this kind of work. If you'd like to explore membership at various levels with the Albert Kahn Legacy Foundation or consider making a donation to support our work, please visit our website, albertkahnlegacy.org. That's albertkahnlegacy.org. A couple of upcoming events you might want to hear about on our next lecture after tonight is on February 23rd. That will feature Steve Bonnet speaking about restoring the historic lighting at major Albert Kahn buildings like the Fisher Building and the aquarium on Belle Isle. And then on Sunday, April 23rd, we're partnering with the Detroit Historical Museum for an in-person lecture by author Dale Carlson, who will be talking about the relationship between Albert Kahn and Corrado Parducci, the famous architectural sculptor. So again, you can find more information about those events and all the events on our calendar coming up this year at our website, albertkahnlegacy.org. So let me introduce our speaker. Karen Miller is an associate professor at Oakland University. She's a specialist in public policy in the early 20th century. Her most recent interest includes the impact of growth on the city of Detroit in the early 20th century, which of course is the Albert Kahn era. And she's currently working on a book with a fairly provocative title. It's about the history of Detroit during World War II, entitled All for One But None for You, Living in Detroit's Arsenal of Democracy. So I know from experience that books take a long time to complete, but when it's out, Karen, we'll have you back and you can talk about that one too.
Okay.
But tonight, let me turn this over to Karen Miller, Oakland University, talking about Albert Kahn and the making of Detroit.
Well, I do want to thank you all for inviting me. It's a great honor, and I'm slightly fearful because I'm not an architectural historian, and Albert Kahn is of interest to me, but his role in my work is more about how I think about him as symbolic of larger shifts in Detroit in the first half of the 20th century. So hopefully my perspective, where Albert Kahn is sort of a sidebar to my work, will be useful to you, and hopefully I can learn some things in the Q&A and other ways of getting in touch with you that will help me think more about how Kahn's work really affects the sort of larger path that I'm taking in terms of my scholarship. What I want to do tonight is actually talk about the sort of larger trajectory of Kahn's career. So I fear that I will not tell you very much that's terribly new to you. However, I'm hoping to provoke you into thinking about things differently than you have been thinking about them. And that's my real purpose tonight, is just to allow you to maybe look at Kahn from a slightly different perspective, and hopefully that will enrich your understanding of his work. Albert Kahn, Albert Kahn came to Detroit when Detroit was still really a minor urban area. There was a little over 100,000 people when he moved here as a child. And Detroit was a very small city. And so here you see one of the annexation maps of Detroit, which I think very nicely illustrates the growth of the city in the early 20th century. Detroit was in that highlighted area that has a black border around it at the, right there above the word river on Detroit River. That's Detroit. It's a tiny town physically. It has a relatively small population. It's kind of mundane in that sense. It is tiny compared to Chicago and so on and so forth. So it's not a Midwestern powerhouse. However, by the time that Albert Kahn gets to the kind of full stride of his work, we see the city expanding enormously. And so the thing I like about this map is that it also provides all the dates of annexation. And so you can see there is this kind of slow growing out in the 80s while he's still a boy. But by the time we get to his career emerging, we've expanded deep into Wayne County and to the border of Oakland and Macomb counties. And as the city grows, as the population increases, during his lifetime about tenfold, Albert Kahn is going to be an active participant in this growth. And in some ways, I think he helps to drive that growth. And in other ways, he is pulled along by that growth. And those are the sorts of things that I want to talk about tonight. This idea that a young boy could come to the city, could establish himself, and be able to have such an impact on the development of a major metropolitan area in the United States. It really is remarkable. So I think about, as I talk tonight, I want you to think about this map and this reality of the geography of Detroit. And also I'm inviting you to then consider the expansion of the city of Detroit. Detroit is not simply the city that it was in the 1880s, but it becomes a metropolitan area where the surrounding parts of Wayne County, but also certainly Oakland and Macomb County and parts of Washtenaw County even, become really inseparably tied to the economy of Detroit. And Kahn will then be able to have an impact in these areas as well. When the public thinks about Kahn, when he is talked about in freshman history classes in university and so on and so forth, he's really viewed as an industrial figure, an industrial architect. And so I wanted to begin tonight just reminding everyone of the accomplishments that we see with Kahn in terms of how he changes the conceptualization of factory work in the United States. This is one of his first major projects, the Packard plant. And in many respects, it's revolutionary at the time of its construction. It is a facility that invites this idea of light and movement inside the factory floor. And what we have is a situation where suddenly the assembly work of automobiles or any large item can be facilitated in ways that really had not happened before. And just to remind you that much of this is about an exploitation of recent breakthroughs in terms of architectural design, that when we think about the construction of Packard, the Packard plant, that there are all of these components that had not been aggressively used in architecture, but are in this case used with dramatic effect. Being able to open up the inside of the factory floor, being able to illuminate the floor, and being able to create a large enough space where something as large as automobiles actually can be manufactured. And I don't think I need to tell you how intellectually impactful this is on the automotive industry. Once you see Packard and this embrace of the sort of larger structure of factory work, other automakers very quickly fall into line and then begin being able to imagine a completely different way of manufacturing automobiles. And so, although this is certainly an important intellectual breakthrough, it helps to tie Henry Ford to Kahn, but usually when the neophytes about Kahn think about him, the first place that they think about is really Highland Park. Highland Park is supposed to really exploit all of those breakthroughs that Kahn had been making in terms of design, the kind of work he was making with his brother, in terms of thinking about the actual structure of buildings. And the objective here is this idea of kind of, bringing a new kind of shop floor. And a couple things I just want to remind you about. Highland Park is not only not in the city limits of Detroit, but this is before the city has really begun to surround Highland Park. And so it's really an outpost physically, geographically from the rest of the city. Ford certainly selects this with that in mind. He wants to be away from all kinds of political and economic concerns in the city. He's looking for low tax rates, all those sorts of things. But also, what I want to emphasize here with Highland Park is its accessibility to the general population, that people can walk down the street and see inside the building and watch the process more or less. And this idea of observation of manufacturing becomes a very important part of Detroit's identity, that we think of ourselves as a city of producers, of makers, that what we produce is something that has an extraordinarily high regard. So when we compare the fate of, say, Detroit to New York, where the primary manufacturing is garment industry, the garment industry is an industry that certainly is critically important, but garment workers receive absolutely no respect. They are not considered to be all that important. The plants come and go constantly, that you have constant bankruptcies in the business. And so the fact that Detroiters can walk past the Highland Park plant and watch automobiles being manufactured changes the way that people in the city think about the role of the city. And the automakers are certainly very interested in developing this notion of Detroit as the center of automotive production. And that's a clearly contestable thing at the beginning of the 20th century. I mean, there are a lot of cities that would argue that there's the center of automobile production certainly before 1914, and even until about 1919 or 1920. And this fact that you have the accessibility of the plant to the general public helps to alter the culture of Detroit, I would argue. And so with this plant on the periphery of the city, we suddenly start seeing an enormous expansion of the city. If you want to think about that map that I showed you at the beginning, that suddenly, by 1915, after we see the first real use of an assembly line and the acceptance of the $5 day, that after that happens, suddenly Detroit begins swallowing up property all around Highland Park, around Hamtramck, that we have this massive expansion of the city to basically envelop the automotive industry. And so there is this constant push outward and sort of embracing this idea of an automotive culture as the identity of the city. Very importantly, I think for the industry, we see this openness at Highland Park. As Kahn is using the technology of architecture to be able to open up the floor space, it does fundamentally shift the way that automotive manufacturers can think about plant space. And this sort of opens up all kinds of opportunities to improve the process, to change the process, to shift a factory from the production of one product to another. And so the automotive industry becomes more than simply the automotive industry. It becomes the truck industry, it becomes the tractor industry. It becomes the boat industry in some respects, certainly during World War I. And this flexibility of Kahn designs helps Detroit auto manufacturers to imagine a greatness of the city, but also helps Detroiters to think about the kind of massive level of production that we're going to see in this city by the time we get to the 1920s. Kahn will not stop at Highland Park. It became clear that the process at Highland Park was so successful that it could be more successful if we applied even greater imagination. The problem, of course, is that Highland Park grew very rapidly after the Ford plant was started. And it's difficult to acquire large parcels of land. I mean, Highland Park plant sits on about 56 acres at the time of World War I. And the sense is that Ford wanted a much larger facility, and that was really not easily found, not only in the city of Detroit, but we would have to go out into the environs around Detroit. And so certainly, as we know, he turns to Dearborn, where he already had existing ties because of his youth. But also he's looking for wide open spaces. And we see once again this idea of speed of movement and continuity of movement through the manufacturing process. And Detroit manufacturing changes the way Americans manufacture things. It's not just cars. That very quickly RCA begins looking at how cars are produced and what can we do to apply that to the manufacture of radios and radio equipment. That furniture companies start looking at the process. They're less successful, but nonetheless, we see this sort of generalized transformation of manufacturing in the United States, of assembly, at least, being really fed by the imagination of Kahn in terms of the design of factories. And Kahn works very well with a number of people in the various plants. He understands the problems that the Ford Motor Company wants to overcome, but also works happily with other companies as well. He's not certainly exclusive to Ford. And so there's this massive shift to the point where in the 1920s, if you're going to be a successful automotive company, you've essentially bought into the ideas of assembly that are first sort of incubated at Packard and then at Highland Park and then at Rouge. And very quickly, what we see is this transformation of GM after its bankruptcy. We see transformations at Chrysler. And we also see other automotive companies starting to fall by the wayside. And those that are least willing to sort of embrace this idea of focusing on mass production in the most creative and imaginative ways possible are the ones that have difficulty succeeding in the end. I just wanted to mention that this is going to continue all through Kahn's life. That, we see when River Rouge is not enough in World War II, that we need to start thinking about how we're going to manufacture airplanes, and that the existing, facilities that we have are not going to be enough. He moves on to Willow Run. And so there is this willingness to identify new problems and being able to adapt the architectural technology of the day in ways that we don't see in a lot of other cities. And certainly it's not that Kahn plants don't exist in other places. Certainly he's building them really all over the Midwest and New York and so on and so forth in Canada. But it's because that's what you have to do to keep up. And other architects begin sort of copying the techniques. And so not all plants that seem to look like Kahn plants were actually designed by him, but we see that sort of generalized movement in this direction. As a result of this, what we see is a force that helps to move more and more automotive work to the edges of the city and to the outskirts of the city. And this is a movement that continues well beyond World War II. That, when we look at the period between the end of World War II and the beginning of the 1960s, the 25 plants that are built for automotive manufacture in metropolitan Detroit are all built outside of the city. And that's because increasingly there's this emphasis on expansiveness of footprint, on being able to acquire inexpensive land, of being able to link to transportation hubs like rivers and railroads and so on and so forth. And so Kahn's architecture of manufacturing helps to propel the city outward, helps to really reinforce this idea of going into Dearborn, of crossing Joy Road, of moving up into Oakland and Macomb counties during World War II, and then continuing that movement even after that. And eventually, one can argue, the deindustrialization of metropolitan Detroit is a kind of logical culmination of this direction. So this, I think, is the most obvious connection that Albert Kahn has to the city of Detroit in terms of its evolution during this period. But it's also important, I think, to remember that he's not just an industrial architect. I mean, it is, I think, arguably in the world, people who know Kahn, that's what they know him for. They know him for Willow Run, they know him for the Rouge. He was this big fancy industrial architect in Detroit. But that's not the only thing that he was interested in by any stretch of the imagination. And what he does outside of building factories, I think, also helps to explain some of the progression of the city during his lifetime. And so I wanted to spend the rest of the time tonight sort of talking about that kind of progression. Very early in his career, he manages to secure several important architectural contracts. One is for the aquarium at Belle Isle. We have to remember at the beginning of the 20th century, the city fathers of Detroit, so political figures, the economic figures in the city, all want to elevate Detroit's stature. And that means embracing symbols of middle-class success. that good, successful cities should have certain things. They should have zoos. They should have aquariums. They should have museums. They should have concert halls. They should have theaters. And they shouldn't just be raggedy, nasty buildings where you can go see a bunch of sick tigers or see a bad play with bad sound. It's like these are buildings that are expressly built for this. And so as we look at Kahn's early architectural career, we see him making important inroads in terms of securing contracts for these kinds of entities. That we see his work on securing the contract for the aquarium. This is, remember, the waterworks still exists and is still a public venue at this point. It's one of the most popular public parks in the city of Detroit. And so this idea of developing Belle Isle as also a kind of recreational spot is something that makes enormous sense, even though they are not yet fully developing the riverfront the way that we do in the kind of post-industrial era in Detroit. And so this is, it's a pretty building. It conforms with a lot of the architecture of the style. I mean, it has some of the sort of internal components that allow for a lot of openness inside the aquarium, which is very nice, and it's, you know, very mechanical inside and all that. So, I mean, there's a kind of aspect of industrialism about this, even though the average visitor doesn't even see it. But I mean, one of the things, the first time I saw this building, I thought this is so reminiscent of some of the buildings in the Central Park Zoo, that there is a kind of type of building that is formal, that is pretty, that is designed to uplift people. And we see the same sort of thing at Temple Bethel, that he is asked, he belongs to this temple, and he is asked to design the nice temple. I mean, this is not the first place where these folks worshipped. But the idea is we want a place that demonstrates success, that demonstrates that our community has made it in Detroit, that we are respectable citizens. And so what you see is that kind of classical architectural training coming through in these kinds of projects. That Kahn likes to use a lot of that kind of Greco-Roman style that harks to this idea of establishment, of democracy, of success. And when we think about the placement of you know, we're up here now. I mean, it's, you know, now in what we think of as pretty deep into Detroit. But this is a fairly posh neighborhood when it's first built. It's where richer people live. It's a neighborhood where we see a kind of sense of establishment. This is where Charles Lindbergh grew up, was not too far away from this. And so when we think about this kind of footprint of cultural establishment, this is what Kahn is really pushing forward, that he has I think his stuff is beautiful. I think he's got a great eye. He understands how buildings need to look to create a certain public sense. And we see this with his work. This will continue into the 1910s. So as he is, you know, working on Highland Park and Rouge and so on and so forth, we see his work at the Detroit Athletic Club, which is certainly in many respects a kind of symbol of achievement in Detroit. The Detroit Athletic Club is for rich people who are kind of athletic. But it's mostly a place where you can go and have a nice lunch and not have to go to a restaurant where the hoi polloi might be. It's a place where if you want to go bowling for a few hours, because you've had a really bad day at the office, you can do that. If you want to play some handball, that this is a place that is designed for the relaxation of successful businessmen. And around the Detroit Athletic Club is this perception of a kind of openness, that the public sees it as a building, that this is where rich people go to talk to each other, where they go to relax. That if you have buildings like this in Detroit, it means that we have success, that that we need to highlight our successful people to understand how we are successful as a city. We also see very different kinds of architectural styles. I mean, one of the things that I picked these four examples in large part because the type of architecture is so different from building to building. So this is a person with enormous flexibility in terms of thinking about how to project ideas into buildings and how to use those buildings to project ideas back onto the society that helped to create them. So this last is the National Theater. It's one of the larger, more successful theaters in the 1910s and 20s. And it is very different than the Detroit Athletic Club or the Temple Beth El, but it's designed to do something different. It's designed to create a kind of sense of exoticism, of Orientalism, as it were. That when we think about Americans at the beginning of the 20th century, this is a period in which Orientalism is something that's used as a device to demonstrate sophistication. And so you want a theater district that doesn't just have plain fronts or even plain fronts with big signs in front. You want a building that really stands out as unique. You want a building that stands out as unusual, something unlike anything that had existed before. And when you think about, these four buildings, also consider how really underdeveloped some parts of Detroit are. In the poor neighborhoods of Detroit, what we see is just this kind of architecture of topsy, where somebody owned a shack and he figures out, if I built an addition onto it, I could rent it out to 6 more people. And it's horrendous in parts of downtown. And so when we think about what Detroit looks like in poor neighborhoods and what it is aspiring to be, a city with a prosperous working class, a city with an even more prosperous economic leadership, a city that is sophisticated, a city that embraces all that is modern. Kahn is very much at the forefront of helping that to be part of Detroiters' imagination. He's certainly not the only architect in the city doing this, but in many respects, he is the most influential, I would argue, simply because he is so aggressively working in terms of thinking about these kinds of structures. As he's working on these kinds of buildings, he is still making private residences. This is not to say that he's not building people's homes at the same time. It's not to say that he's not also building factories. These are not separate phases of his life, but his architectural firm is sort of layering one upon the other these attributes of an extraordinarily flexible, ambitious, and also imaginative architectural firm. And I think that's something that we all need to be reminded of every now and then. Kahn designs a lot of buildings in the 1920s, and what we do see at this time is a shift more and more over to office space. And I want to point out that as more and more factories are moving into the periphery of the city, as we're moving out beyond Connor and up above 6 Mile and out, beyond Joy and that sort of thing, there are fewer and fewer large plants in the city because they're simply it's simply deemed that there's not enough footprint for them. Clark Street, the GM plant down there, is one of the exceptions to the rule, but and the Dodge Main, but nonetheless, there's this movement of manufacturing out of the city. And one of the things that I was really struck to learn in the 1920s is that how much vacant space there was south of West Grand Boulevard, that a lot of warehousing had been abandoned, a lot of factories, small factories that had been abandoned. There's a whole lot of things that are called parking lots. I think that's more about taxation rights than anything. But buildings get torn down, and you have to explain their existence, and so, well, they're parking lots. But that creates an interesting vacuum downtown. And the downtown of the city becomes more and more about construction of office space. This is something that had really begun much earlier. The construction of the Michigan Station, Michigan Central, is one that is necessary in terms of providing railway service to the city of Detroit. But the amount of office space that was built connected to that structure was astonishing. And it has to do with this increasing reimagination of the old part of the city, the part of the city that existed when Mr. Kahn first came to Detroit, that we want to turn this into office building structures. And so the old downtown, we want to move out. We want to use slum clearance to get rid of poor neighborhoods as much as possible. This goes in wholesale activity in the 1930s. But also, we want to start converting more and more of the sense of why people are downtown to going more and more into this idea of office space. And so there's this idea of, General Motors is interested in bringing its headquarters into the city and creating this one sort of singular structure. And Kahn is perfectly happy to help them in that design. And this is absolutely enormous. I think we look at it today and we think, oh yeah, it's an office building that, but this was in the 1920s a scale that really had never, and I wouldn't say never been imagined, but certainly never achieved. That Kahn is able to do this, to sort of, take the ambitions of General Motors and try to turn that into a single building. And we see a lot, I think there's a kind of structural reminiscence between Kahn's factories and his office buildings. Buildings are really quite beautiful and do very much mimic classical or other kinds of European architecture. But what we see in this new General Motors headquarters is more of a building that is designed to look kind of like a factory, but not a factory, I think. And that there's this idea that at the same time, when you go into the building, it's clearly not a factory. It's gorgeous inside. That this is not a building where people just come in and work. It's a building that people come in just to look at the first floor of the building, that you enjoy getting invited over to a meeting over there, because this is an opportunity to go inside and see all this stuff. And in large part, the leadership at General Motors wants this because they are, at this point, Mr. Sloan is very much committed to this idea of GM becoming the automotive company of not just America, but of the world. And that he wants an architectural structure that will awe people. And so he finds a very good partner in the Kahn Associates in terms of being able to think about this building as a way to reimagine GM. And just, recall GM had just gone through bankruptcy in less than a decade earlier. I mean, they were a failed corporation that almost completely disappeared. And then suddenly in the 1920s, they overtake Ford as the major manufacturer. And this building is about establishing that status in a symbolic kind of way. We see really a network tied to the building, to the GM headquarters, that the Fisher building is very much built in tandem with it. And once again, there's this idea of the building that it's going to look modern, that it's going to mimic some of the aesthetic styles of factories, but at the same time, it's going to mimic some of the aesthetic styles of some of the major New York City skyscrapers. And so there's this notion, and it's not uncommon in the 1920s that city leaders will talk about how Detroit is going to overtake Chicago and how it's going to eventually overtake New York, that Detroit is the new center of America. And that kind of hubris is something that encourages extraordinary commitment to the establishment of these large buildings that are designed to sort of position Detroit as this major international city. Now, I do want to just say, and this is something not of an afterthought, but of something of a closing, but it does need to be said. Kahn's buildings were not just for institutions and for businesses. They were also places for people to live. And he did a very good job in terms of helping individual families sort of establish their stature in neighborhoods. And so when we think about where so many of his homes are located in Metro Detroit, it is important to remember that he's a very important force in Indian Village. He's not an unimportant force at all in Boston Edison. These are both neighborhoods that are where successful people are seeking to move because they want to live in a neighborhood of successful people. So in that sense, it has the same kind of architectural idea as things like the Detroit Athletic Club. But he's also involved in Palmer Woods and Grosse Pointe to a certain extent. And so he is following the business leadership of Detroit as it is moving further and further away from the old city. So when he was a boy, a lot of rich people lived just south of Cass Avenue and in that, or excuse me, just to the east of Cass Avenue and near Warren and that area, that there's a lot of right now what Wayne State uses as fraternity houses and that sort of thing. Used to be homes of rich people, successful lumber people, successful, salesmen, successful, bankers, etc. But they started moving as the city began expanding and following that movement of wealth up above Chicago Boulevard into Boston Edison, eventually into Palmer Woods. And as we have this movement, Kahn is being commissioned to do homes in these areas. And I wanted to close by talking just briefly about two of his most famous big wealthy people homes. The first one is actually the one on the right. Sorry, I got the positioning of these not quite the way I had originally intended. And this is the Cranbrook House. This is built in 1908 for the Booth family. It is about sort of, explaining the success of arts and crafts. I mean, it's sort of when we think about the architectural style of this building and compare it, say, for example, to Temple Beth El, either the original version or then the later one that's built up on Piety Hill. Both of those are very kind of classical structures that are designed to evoke a certain sensibility about what is and what is not success. The Booths very much wanted to revere arts and crafts, and Kahn was perfectly happy to oblige them. And so you have this flexibility that he sees in terms of working with his people to be able to think about what do they want and what did they see as success, and still nonetheless be able to create this absolutely magnificent, awe-inspiring structure. And we see a sort of similar effect when we look on the left-hand side, is the Ford House in Grosse Pointe, the Edsel and Eleanor Ford House. And this is built in the 30s, so it's much later, but once again, it sort of demonstrates this is how they saw achievement kind of embodied in a building. And this is how we want to be viewed as we think about ourselves, but also as other people think about us. This is our idea of success. And so when we think about how Detroiters think about themselves, and it is important to think about, how rich people think about themselves, because they in many respects are sort of charting the success of the city in the 1920s and through about the 1950s. But also how just regular Detroiters think about the city of Detroit as they walk down Woodward Avenue and walk past the new Temple Beth El, or as they walk down the West Grand Boulevard and see these buildings, as they go out to Belle Isle. That it's important for Detroiters to think about the success of the city of Detroit, that this very much reifies the idea of the success and the efficacy of the expansion of the city, both in terms of its physical footprint, but also in terms of its population. So hopefully I have at least given you something to think about. If I haven't told you anything that you didn't already know, that often some of the things that I enjoy the most myself as an academic are looking at the familiar and thinking way. And that was my goal tonight. And hopefully I didn't bore anyone too much.
No, okay. Karen, listen, no, it was a fascinating tour, and we really appreciate it. Folks, if you have questions for Karen, please click the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen and type your question in there, and we'll get to as many as we can. Our first one from Levi, who asked about the new center, the site of the Fisher Building and the GM Building, being a sort of new downtown for Detroit. Can you talk about the concept there? Why put it there?
Well, part of it is this idea of moving into open space. Although there is an enormous amount of space downtown that is parking lots, most of the lots are not terribly big. And the imagination of General Motors, really, Sloan is kind of driving this as best as I can figure, is that they want to be able to create this really enormous footprint. Also, there's this sense of the city physically moving. One of my favorite transformations of the 1920s is what happens to Central High School. Central High School, it's down at Wayne State. It's the big yellow building. I think it's now called Adam Annie Hall. It used to be the Central High School for the city of Detroit. And it wasn't big enough. It was a neighborhood that was starting to go downhill. There were some concerns. All the rich people were moving up into that area adjacent to Highland Park, up into Boston Edison and Palmer Woods. And there was this idea that Central High School should be the elite school where all of the best students were, and there was this sort of anticipation that that would be rich kids. And so they built a new school building up in this area, and it's sort of like when admirals move from one ship to another and they change their flagship. So Central High still exists, but it moved, I think, 12 miles north of where it had been. And it's this huge complex. It's called the Roosevelt Complex now, that had a high school, a feeder middle, intermediate school, and a feeder elementary school. It's up in that area, just right above the corner of Highland Park. And so there is, in the 1920s, this notion that at least parts of the city and the way that we think about downtown, and the way that we think about this economic center of the city, there is this contestation in New Center, in that geography, and it's sort of brought about by GM wanting to build this huge headquarters, and they want to make it central, and they kind of position it in where they think the new center is going to be, and so that's why they don't try to build it downtown. They don't, close up the Clark plant and try to build it there. That actually would have been a more than large enough footprint, but then you'd lose an auto plant. Mm-hmm. There are a lot of office buildings that are being built in that downtown area. Kahn designs a lot of them, actually. Mm-hmm. But in this particular case, that's that idea. And I think there's a certain reality to that. I think that in many respects, that area north of Wayne State is a kind of quasi secondary downtown, if it's not a primary downtown today.
Mm-hmm. Okay, our friend Mike Hodges is asking, he loves your knowledge and familiarity with the city. He asks, are you a native Detroiter?
I'm not.
Where are you from?
I'm from Blairsville, Pennsylvania, which is sort of Pennsylvania's version of the UP.
Came here for the job, right?
I came here for the job. I got a job offer at Oakland. It was a really good job offer. I took it. I do public policy making. I used to do Washington, D.C. public policy making, and to a certain extent, I still do. But I was here as an assistant professor, and this is a confession that I can only make because I'm so close to retirement. But at one point, I was trying to finish my first book, and so I was spending, months at a time away from my family in Iowa and in Washington, D.C. and, all these other places. And, it suddenly occurred to me, it's like, I want to do research where I don't have to, where I can come home and sleep in my own bed at night. And by that point, Sidney Fine was sort of winding down his career. And I thought, well, it's not that there are plenty of people who are really good historians of Detroit at U of M, but I thought, okay, there's a little window here, and maybe I can kind of creep in and handle it. And so, yeah, I was a total ignoramus about Detroit in 1990, and I am less of an ignoramus today. And I thank you very much for thinking I know stuff.
Okay. Doug is asking a question that actually comes up a lot at our lectures about Albert Kahn was working for a lot of guys who were known to be anti-Semitic, most notoriously Henry Ford himself. And, we've had a lot of different answers to this. How do you think Albert negotiated that in his own mind and heart, would you say?
Bless him. I don't know. I mean, I'll tell you, I have not, I know Albert Kahn from the periphery around Albert Kahn. I have not gone into his records. I have, I don't know if he kept a diary. I certainly haven't read it. The kind of the kind of information where I might be able to understand exactly what was going on here, I just don't have. So I, but I'm still going to say I have an opinion. America is a profoundly anti-Semitic place during most of Kahn's lifetime. And as weird as this might sound, Detroit is actually not horribly anti-Semitic, even though, yes, you have Henry Ford. I think Henry Ford, who could just be a horrible human being at times. I hope there's no one in the Ford family here that would disagree with that and come hunt me down and shoot me. But I think a lot of his anti-Semitism was really incredibly just reflexive. It wasn't, as so much anti-Semitism is. We know him as an anti-Semite simply because he had the Dearborn Independent. I mean, you know, my Uncle Werner would say some of the same things that would come out of Henry Ford's mouth, but nobody knew that except the people who ate Thanksgiving dinner with him. And Henry Ford, by many accounts, could be a very nice person, could be a kind person. Certainly, if you were, and Albert Kahn was certainly a really hard worker. He was very good at kind of understanding what his clients wanted, and I think clients really appreciate that. And so I think Kahn sort of tolerated it in large part because he probably knew that it could be a whole lot worse in some other places.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the things that strikes me, I spent a lot of time working in Boston Edison because I was working at the Archdiocese archives. And so I drove around that neighborhood a whole lot. And started going deeper and deeper into the history of the neighborhood. And it's fascinating because it's not a WASP neighborhood, which you would think. You would think, okay, rich people, rich white guys, they're all WASPs. They all, want to be together and they all live in this. But you have, the Siegel mansion that Kahn designed. You've got, the seminary is up there. There are major temples in this area. And there seems to have been a kind of weird tolerance that if you bought into Detroit is a magnificent place to live, Detroit is the future of America, that you are measured by your economic success, that you are measured by your hard work and diligence, that all of that kind of stuff is the sort of things that actually, looked pretty open. And so I can see that Kahn would think, well, yeah,
Put up with it.
Put up with it.
Yeah.
Because it's not that awful, it could be worse.
Yeah. Rebecca asked a question that I think we know the answer to. Did Kahn leave a lot of writing about his work that survives? And I think the answer is no. And maybe Michael Hodges, I think you can maybe, if you can type in something here in Q&A, but
I totally defer to Michael on this.
Yeah, Frank Lloyd Wright left an enormous body of writing. Yamasaki did, Mies van der Rohe, Le Corbusier, all left, lots and lots of writing about the theory of architecture. I don't think Kahn was probably too busy to do a lot of that, and I don't think a lot of that really survives. As Rebecca notes, there was a speech he gave, a sort of putting down modern architecture fairly late in his career, somewhat intemperate put down of what the European modernists were doing. But there's not a lot of sort of treatises that he wrote about it. I think he was just too busy doing it to theorize.
Yeah, I would kind of agree. I mean, I've spent the last month really looking at a lot of Albert Kahn buildings. And I mean, the number of them is just astonishing. But also there's this, I mean, he really, he, as much as he complains about, modernism and Le Corbusier and that sort of thing, he also is, he's very kind of Euro centric in terms of the way that he thinks about aesthetics. And he keeps coming back to those more classical ideas about architectural aesthetics. So yeah, but
Yeah.
but that's just by looking at his buildings. That's not by anything that I know that he said. So.
Yeah. Beverly is asking about any aviation related buildings that Kahn may have designed, and of course the Willow Run bomber plant in World War
Mhm.
II.
Yeah.
Also, one of our previous lectures, Beverly, was about some airplane hangars that he designed down in Jacksonville, or at least the company did. I think he was still involved. He died in 1942, but that they were designed down in Jacksonville, Florida. So yeah, he was into aviation to some extent, as well as the automotive stuff. And here's Michael Hodges on Kahn's writings. The answer is no. Kahn left a lot of pro forma business letters and a couple dozen family letters, but no diary. He didn't seem to comment on his work. As he notes, he has some disdain for European modernism. So you have to interpret Albert through his buildings rather than through his writings. Well, tell you what, I think we're going to wrap it up there. I want to thank Karen very much for a delightful conversation this evening. I have one more event to note on our upcoming calendar. March 19th, we're going to be out at the Clements Library at the University of Michigan, which is celebrating its anniversary. We're going to have an event out there to help them celebrate that. And you can find that event and the video of Karen's lecture this evening and all our other events on our website, albertkahnlegacy.org. So Karen, we look forward to having you back when your book comes out. And as I said, I know books take a long time, but we look forward to that. And thanks again for a really insightful, delightful lecture this evening.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me, and it was a pleasure to think about this stuff, and it was a pleasure even more to share it with people who really know the material. And I hope I didn't make too many gaffes and provided you with some new ways of thinking about some old stuff.
Terrific, Karen. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you.